No, it's tricky.
Yeah,
It's
this
tricky.
is really tricky.
Yeah.
Well, let's introduce.
Jonathan. Nice to know.
Hello,
Okay.
Michael.
Hello, Andrea. Nice to meet you.
So shall we begin? Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, buenos días a todos. Good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this roundtable as a part of this conference. Please let me start by asking the presentation to be on the screen, please, so that we can start. This roundtable is focused on one major issue that is among the 10 topics that we have prepared for the conference. This topic is the one on the data and knowledge production in higher education institutions. And the data and knowledge production is important in several regards, not only in terms of the technicalities involved in the production of the data and the dissemination of knowledge, but especially in relation to why we produce data, why we produce knowledge, what we do with this. And so it's more than a technical problem, it's more something that is more embedded in the way our institutions are organized, the way our institutions work, the way our institutions address different social problems. So for this panel, we have 4 people with us, and let me introduce them. In first place is Michela Martin. Michela is a program specialist at the Institute, the UNESCO Institute for International Institute for Educational Planning in Paris. She is currently in charge of the research and development area there, and she has worked on more than 25 years in research and teaching in the fields of higher education, especially in relation to policy, governance, and planning. Over the years, she's worked on institutional management in higher education institutions, university enterprise partnerships and collaboration, indicators for quality monitoring and quality assurance. It's a real pleasure to have you, Michela, with us here today. We also have Professor Badash Dendev. He is advisor to the Minister of Education and Sciences in Mongolia. He's worked for more than 30 years in the field of higher education policy and management, and also he has collaborated with UNESCO for a number of years as director in different field offices and director of the Division of Social and Human Sciences in headquarters, I understand, in Paris. He's basically interested and focused, his work is basically focused on leadership, management, and strategic planning, open education, and digital transformation of higher education institutions. We also have with us Jonathan Williams. Jonathan is currently working as an independent consultant in the area of higher education. He's based in Nova Scotia in Canada, and he has worked in collaboration with some international organizations like the OECD, the World Bank, and UNESCO, and he's been, until very, very recently, Vice President Director of Research at Higher Education Strategy Associates, which is a company based in Canada, right? They have actually produced a very interesting report on higher education very recently. And finally, here beside my dear colleague, Andrea Nedma. And Andrea is especially with almost 2 decades working in the area of international education, especially working in universities, governments, research institutions, and consulting organizations in Latin America and Europe. He has a doctoral degree in higher education from University College London, and she currently is working as an associate expert at UNESCO section for higher education in Paris. In this capacity, she just recently prepared a report for this conference. So let me just briefly introduce a little bit this topic on the basis of the documentation we have prepared for the conference. If you go to the website, and that's the first thing I want to say, is that if you go to the website of the conference, you can download the different background documents that we have prepared for here. That's basically the indication of the roadmap, which is the main document, and the others, that's the link for the background documents. Within the link, the background documents, you will find the background document number 8, which is this particular topic. And that document is basically organized in this way. First, it reviews the current status of international official statistics on higher education that is basically produced by the UNESCO Institute for Statistics based in Montreal. My colleague Saeed Boufal is here with us. I'm sure he will be part of this conversation in a few minutes. I mean, that's the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, the main office or the main division within UNESCO that is responsible for the compilation and dissemination of official statistics in the different fields that UNESCO works. But also we cover some other sources, particularly the OECD, the existence of university rankings, household surveys that can be used for analysis of higher education issues. Obviously, the emerging presence of institutional repositories and current research information systems that have been developed over the past few years, and also what is done in the World Higher Education Database here in Barcelona. But beyond this review of what we have today, the background document moves into the area of what are the challenges that we have in relation to the data that we currently have, and those challenges are basically organized in two areas. Things that have to do with the data as it is now, what are the, let's say, gaps that we have in the production of data today, but also in terms of the transformations in the area of higher education that are going to have an impact on the data that we need to produce in the future, or actually that we need to produce today probably for many of these topics. The current limitations that we found, I mean, if I have to summarize this in 2 lines, is basically what is written in the slide. We have limited coverage of, what we produce as official statistics in this area. Limited coverage, especially if we compare that with what the UIS is already doing in the field of, let's say, basic and compulsory education. I mean, it's difficult to understand why we have less data for higher education than the data that we have for primary and secondary, when at country levels, let's say in a given country, we can have 50, 100 tertiary education institutions and several thousands basic education institutions with less resources, and we are able to produce data. I mean, our states are able to produce data for the basic sector, for the compulsory education, and not so able to produce the data to the same extent for higher education institutions. That's a question that we need to address. No? And that's the first issue that is covered in this topic. Obviously, and the challenges ahead are diverse, because we have, as we are discussing in this conference, higher education is experiencing an important transformation, and that transformation has to do with at least some of the topics that we have listed here. First, to understand higher education in terms of a lifelong learning perspective, and not only in terms of a step in a ladder that comes right after secondary education. Second, in terms of flexibility in program orientation and the way the programs are organized as well, micro-credentials and different ways of providing higher education services. Third, in terms of international mobility and recognition studies and how international mobility is going to change over the next few years as well. Third, what we just saw in the report that was presented in the previous panel in this room, in terms of the need for moving beyond the disciplinary limits and trying to encourage and foster a more interdisciplinary dialogue and also a transdisciplinary practice that is enable us to address more complex problems. The next point is related to the relationship between the academic and the professional orientation of tertiary education, not only in terms of the different institutions that we have, but also in terms of what happens within our institutions. And academic institutions can have programs that are more professionally oriented than academically oriented, so that balance is not always clearly discussed and addressed. Actually, we see a couple of those things in this conference when we equate, and sometimes we equate higher education with universities, and higher education is much more than universities. It's much more complex than that. It's not only what academic institutions do. And obviously, these two topics that have been highlighted in terms of sustainability and equity are major problems that we have to address. So that's basically my introduction. With this introduction, what we are going to do is we are going to have a sort of 2 rounds of interventions here, and then we are going to open the floor for a more general conversation. So without much ado, I will ask Professor Dendev Michela, sorry, can I ask you to start today? Yes, yes, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, so my microphone is working. Cesar, thank you very much for this introduction. I think you have set the scene a little bit of the challenges that we are facing. I want to go a little bit deeper in setting the scene when we discuss the issue of data and knowledge production, because I think it is important to think about, the current trends that we are facing in higher education. And I want to talk a little bit here from a planning perspective, as I'm from a planning institute. So of course, data and information is really paramount when we venture into planning exercises, not only because we diagnose the existing system, and then we are looking into available statistics, we're doing a trend analysis before we venture into the planning process. So what is this context? And I think one of the basic elements is, of course, the major expansion of higher education systems worldwide, particularly, I think I would say over the past 15 years, much more in the global south. So we have rapidly expanding higher education systems. We have many new higher education institutions being created. They're often fragile. Still, they have to be consolidated. We are still having a lot of ambitious targets in higher education policies for further expansion. I'm only thinking about India, that is having a very ambitious target for moving the gross enrollment ratio, which currently stands at 26%, but to move it to 50% by 2035. So we are going, and this in a country which has a vast young population, so that means another major move to expansion. So we have this rapidly expanding higher education systems in the global south, many new higher education institutions. We are having also increasingly complex set of providers. So of course, universities, technical colleges, private providers, a lot of private provision. We have worldwide something like 30% of enrollments in the private sector, yet often we know we have incomplete statistics at the national level on the private provision. So I think that's a major obstacles to developing a systemic view on higher education. And we have also an increasing amount of students being enrolled in online provision. Again, here we have also very incomplete statistics of how many students are actually taking part in online programs cross-border often at times. And I think we also have to keep in mind that we are working with higher education systems where higher education institutions have an increasing amount of autonomy also. I mean, the issue of autonomy, moving more decisions to the institutional level, I think is really one of the major trends. And when higher education institutions have more autonomy, as I said, there are more decisions to be made at the institutional level. They also need more data. And as you mentioned, Cesar, the preoccupation with equity. So I think we have a clear international agenda to provide equitable quality education, also at the higher education level. And the issue of equity, I think, is really moving into the front because we know that despite expansion, still many young people don't gain access to higher education because of socioeconomic disadvantage, because of maybe ethnic minority status. And we have the issue of refugees. and it's another, I would say, blind spot, because refugees in many countries are not registered as refugee students as such. They are registered as international students. So we do not actually know how many refugees we have in higher education. UNHCR is making estimates, and we are currently estimating that we have a 5% GER in higher education for refugees, but this is only an estimate. It's a rough estimate because precisely we do not know. And there's also, there are certain expectations on higher education. One of the expectations being to provide information on employability. And many times, we are not in a position to say how many graduates are finding a job. And that is actually one of the shortcomings we have in higher education to defend the funding to higher education, to show the outcomes. And I think that is also an issue that we have to deal with. And then maybe I stop here on this scene setting, and maybe later on come back to the lifelong learning issue, because that is an area where I have worked a bit. So I stop here and pass it back to you, Cesar.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Michaela. I mean, I guess it's exactly you are contributing to structure a more broader picture where we can start fitting the conversation. Please, Professor Dende, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me opportunity to express my thoughts on this topic. So let me say a few words about the SDG indicators concerning Mongolia, because we had very nice session before us on the relations with the higher education institutions in the SDGs. So Mongolia is one of the global early adopters of SDGs and has formally anchored SDGs in its long-term development vision documents. The working group on SDG implementation in Mongolia have reviewed and assessed the SDG indicators and concluded that 228 out of 248 SDG global indicators are applicable to Mongolia. Moreover, 71 indicators can be measured at the national level from the National Statistical Office using traditional methods. But the remaining 157 SDG indicators need non-traditional methods, including 6 indicators related to the education. So those indicators can be measured by improving the traditional approach or by developing and using non-traditional approaches. When we are talking about non-traditional approaches, we used it in a broad sense. It includes both data generation from completely new non-traditional sources, such as social media, smart devices, or the data generation from the traditional sources, but processed and presented using non-traditional technologies, such as big data. So I heard from the presentation that there is the limitations and lack of internationally available data on higher education compared with compulsory education. I would like to make 2 points on this topic. My first point is that higher education institutes in different countries possess rich data on higher education, learning and research. But the question is, do they use effectively these data in policy making? In addition to that, while data collection is done very well at the institutional level, but this data fails to make its way to the country-wide and global level in consolidated and organized manner. My second point is that traditional ways of collecting and producing data and knowledge on higher education have become less meaningful. Yesterday, during the session, the many speakers urged the need for change in higher education. One of the remedies for this challenge is big data. Today, many governments, even business and international organizations around the world, are analyzing the way they do business, to adopt it or to change dramatically in order to survive in this new stage. This reality introduced big data and open data concepts, subsequently explaining the need for data revolution for improving SDG measurability. So we all know there are significant potential for big data to contribute to effective policy making. Recently, Mongolia has initiated a study of Mongolian data ecosystem, the impact of big data and preconditions for mobilizing data revolution in Mongolia. Some of the early findings I would like to share with you. The first, there is the need for new source or new technique, such as data value chain concept to gather data for unavailable indicators. The second, single source of data is not sufficient for single source of data is not sufficient to get full insight. The third, most universities and higher education institutions have certain management information system in place, the learning analytics, academic analytics, etc. However, these systems were developed separately and are incompatible with each other. That's why currently Minister of Education and Science of Mongolia is working on establishing integrated higher education management system. It is reviewing business processes and conducting data analysis in order to identify policy and data gap, as well as to ensure data exchange between different management information systems of the different universities and higher education institutes. So I would like to propose to consider that higher education, we need to look at these opportunities opened by new technologies and such as big data. Thank you very much.
On the contrary, thank you so much, Professor Dendev. I think it's absolutely crucial for us to be able to link this international discussion on where we are with what actually happens in every of our member states and our countries. So that kind of experience and that kind of insight is absolutely essential for the discussion. I will ask Jonathan, please, to continue. And
Yeah, sure. All right, I think you can hear me, so just make sure. Very happy to be here. I think frankly, it's a privilege to be here and be able to speak with all of you and to be on this panel. My reflections come from 4 years, I guess, of putting together the World Higher Ed, kind of what came out in a World Higher Ed report at HESA, working with this large group of people that we pulled together over a different time to try and look at data on higher education in 56 countries. We looked at a few other countries and then ultimately didn't include them. But the database ultimately covers over 90% of the world's students, and so gave us, I think, a lot of insights on national data systems and what data are available on higher education globally. The data we came up with in the end, we generated data on enrollments, and that was the most sort of comprehensive data that we were able to do. We broke down that enrollment data based on categories of providers, not exclusively public and private, but also a bit of a deeper dive on kind of comprehensive universities versus specialized universities versus a couple different kinds of vocational higher education institutions, and then certain providers of higher education that are not really higher education institutions at all. So there's a number of countries where there's secondary schools that deliver higher ed programs, or a hospital may deliver a higher education program, but it's really a hospital. It's not a university hospital, for instance. So we developed these data on enrollments. We developed data on institution counts for the kind of 5 categories of higher education institutions. And for those data, we were able to pull that together for all 56 countries. And then the next step was to look at the finances of institutions, and I'm going to focus a lot of my comments today on the financial side of that work. The most common kind of general measure was, you could say, how much governments were spending on higher education. in basically all 56 countries, with some countries where you had to speculate a little bit more. And then we could dig into the institutional finances. So how much money were higher education institutions spending? How much were they receiving from governments? How much were they receiving from compulsory student fees? And there you could begin to see really some of these gaps in what kind of data were available. You'd find really comprehensive data on public universities. You would find less data on public vocational higher education institutions, what we called them hybrids or short cycle higher education institutions. A hybrid is like the University of Applied Sciences in Europe. It's a long cycle vocational higher ed institution. And then you'd see even more gaps when you went into the private system, private sector, although remarkably high coverage if you look at the kind of global picture, because so many of the countries that have a lot of private higher education do track the finances of their private higher education institutions. We then kind of gathered data on fees. So how many students are paying fees in these different countries based on the different institution types? How many students might be paying kind of a regular fee? How many students are paying no fees? How many are paying, in some cases, there might be a reduced fee for certain categories of students, and then obviously there's a host of countries that charge a higher fee to a share of their students, often international students, though not always. And that data you could then work, and then you'd get a little bit less data when you tried to dig into kind of the fee amounts. And finally, the last part of our research dug into government financial support for students, direct financial aid in particular, and gathering data on how many students received loans or grants from their governments or that were backed by their governments, and what was the value of those disbursements. And again, I kind of want to paint this picture of sort of a cascading or declining availability of data as you work through these different categories. I think we were able to cover 48 out of the 56 countries on the student financial aid measures, so still a large number, but you can see it kind of falling back from 56 on the total number of countries with enrollment and institution counts. And so kind of taking a step back from this, what were kind of some takeaways, I think, about the state of data globally? And again, I'll focus on the financing side. I think there have been a lot of comments already about how data reflects kind of the changing realities of higher education, notably in terms of more flexible learning. But thinking about finances, I don't want to overemphasize it, but your classic north-south divide does stand out. In the global north, you can get data on the finances of public higher education institutions almost in every single country, and pretty comprehensively. There are some gaps in terms of vocational higher education institutions, but in the public sector, you generally can know how much institutions, what their finances look like. In the global south, that would be far more of a mixed picture. You have some countries where the data are absolutely terrific in the global south, and you see some really significant improvements in recent years. Kenya, Ghana, Colombia, I think Brazil has significantly improved its data collection on finances. So there have been a lot of improvements, but this north-south divide in terms of kind of transparency about institutional finances is real, and I think will become a more significant problem if you move towards greater institutional autonomy, because part of I think the trade-off in autonomy is you exercise more autonomy, but in exchange we expect more transparency with the funding that you receive. And so tackling those gaps, I think, is going to be really important for us to kind of understand the picture of kind of financing of higher education globally, and for policymakers, I think in the global south especially, to be able to inform themselves with comparative data. The other piece I wanted to speak to was on the student financial aid side. The coverage is much more uneven, and that's much less of kind of a global south, global north question. In the global north, I think the extent to which data is still publicly not terribly available on grant programs, loan programs, is quite noticeable when you compare it to institutional finances. But generally, worldwide, I think it was surprising to us how much data is out there, but the limitations are real, all the same. And so just to give a last couple of points, I think moving forward, there's a lot of potential, I think, for improving kind of data quality. Sub-Saharan Africa stands out as sort of the data. I think a lot of data exists on different countries in Sub-Saharan Africa that just isn't up on websites and has been put together. I think perhaps UNESCO actually has sponsored work to put together data in Sub-Saharan Africa that is not easily accessible for researchers. And so I think that there's a real potential there for improving data quality and understanding on the continent that in some ways is the most important continent for higher education in the next half century, because it's going to, that's where the growth is going to be, or so much of the growth is going to be. And so there's a lot of potential, I think, focusing in that area. And then I think the other, other regions of kind of potential progress on kind of financial transparency that stand out are sort of the Middle East and North Africa, Central and Southern Asia, where it'll be really fascinating, I think, to see if there's a similar pattern of improvement in financial reporting. So those are the thoughts I just wanted to share, but I'm looking forward to the conversation.
No, thank you so much, Jonathan. I think it's also very important to have a nuanced view of the situation. And I mean, in a brief conversation like this, it's easy to jump into overgeneralizations that this happens like that here, and you are introducing that kind of qualifications that, I mean, that prevent us from making assertions of that sort. That's very important, because in the end of the day, even, I mean, Latin American countries, Sub-Saharan Africa countries, or whatever, I mean, are diverse countries with diverse institutional arrangements. And obviously, the way we produce official statistics is directly related to the way we are organized in terms of who reports to who and for what reasons they report or they do not report data. No? And I guess that's the tricky thing here, that the production of official statistics is not just this boring or dull topic about figures. It's, in the end of the day, something about how higher education institutions actually honor the idea that education is a public issue, and therefore we all have public responsibilities in relation to that, not only in terms of transparency, but in terms of informing the way we debate publicly about a public issue and craft policy out of that debate. So the production of statistics is not about figures, it's about a public relevant issue that has to do with education as a public good in the end of the day. So it's about citizens' rights on the way we craft public policies. And obviously that is embedded in the way we are organized, and those ways are absolutely diverse in our countries. Andrea, please.
Thank you so much, Cesar, for the invitation. Good morning, everybody. Can I ask, please, colleagues, if you could put up the slide? So I have one slide to summarize, in a way, some initial thoughts, and I think I may summarize actually some of the ideas that we have already heard from colleagues. And essentially, I think that as higher education systems change in so many ways and so fast, higher education information management systems, we need to adapt. And in a way, it's putting ourselves as people working in data as a servant, if you want, of the higher education sector. So we need to pay attention quite closely to see what's going on. And for that, I think we need to develop more innovations, and if you want, radical and incremental innovations in what regards higher education data. So again, just to summarize what colleagues have said, we see that the higher education sector is changing in terms of learners. So as lifelong learning becomes a reality, there are older people, and as hopefully we're moving faster into more equitable access, we have more refugees and we need more data on that, disabled persons, etc. Then, as Jonathan already mentioned, we have a diverse set of providers in terms of the type of institutions, the size of institutions, and also beyond higher education institutions per se, because we know that technology companies are playing a crucial role now as other providers as well. Then in terms of learning processes, again, technology-assisted learning is becoming essential, and I think we need definitely more data, more analysis on that to learn more. And also, and I mean that's related to the whole learner-oriented pedagogical paradigm, more active and inductive learning, that requires a different approach on understanding the learning process as well. And I know this is more specific, perhaps it's not like system kind of information or system analysis, but I think we also need to dig into what is actually going on, because I think it's fair and we need data on qualifications, but I think we need to move a little bit more towards the spirit of qualification frameworks, in the sense of looking at learning outcomes regardless of how and where and when they were developed. And for that, we need to look a bit more, I think, at the learning processes. And of course, this in terms of information is a huge challenge, and I'm not suggesting that we need to standardize everything about this. I think it's necessary to maintain the diversity and the uniqueness of each learning process, but at least we need to understand a bit of what's going on in that regard to understand better the outcomes. Because in fact, the learning outcomes are also diversifying, at least in the way that policymakers, institutions, students, and society in general appreciate or value learning outcomes. And I would like to highlight here social-emotional learning, that the pandemic has I think it's one of the few perhaps positive things in higher education about the pandemic, that it has highlighted the need for social-emotional skills. And I think we need to look also at learning outcomes in that regard. Then there is a diversification of qualifications, as we have already heard, micro-credentials, etc., funding mechanisms, as Jonathan mentioned, and governance structures, which have to do, I think, with the official structures, but also with the underlying voices, if you want. And I think students, for example, are taking a higher, are more empowered at the end. I think the agency of students it's better exercised now on how to steer the systems. And all of that implies that the higher education sector is changing fast in many different ways, and therefore for us working with data, it's a big challenge to follow up and to be responsive, you know, like, okay, here we are reporting, I prepared this report that Cesar was mentioning, and it was quite interesting to see, okay, what, as I have in the second box there, what metrics matter? What metrics do we have? What metrics matter? And then how can we be, and I'm jumping a little bit on the third box, like how can we balance kind of quick, short-term answers on data that are relevant for each specific context, and at the same time, to think in the long-term stability of indicators, because of course we want to follow up. So there are a few challenges there of how to keep it locally relevant and at the same time globally comparative, how to be dynamic and responsive, but at the same time how to keep it stable. Then how to enhance the multi-sector collaboration. I mean, I'm happy that in this panel we have basically representatives from academia, international organizations, private companies, you know, like, and I mean that I think this shows that there are different actors of the systems that have a role in data about higher education, in the definition of what matters, in the creative process, let's say, of defining indicators, in collecting, processing, and disseminating data. And on the creative bit, I was thinking this morning, actually, I mean, human beings, we are creative, and in creativity theory, one of the lines of thought says that when we are pushed or put under pressure, when there is a strong need, we become actually more creative. And I was thinking, well, for the pandemic, actually, important organizations did some really good, nice work on creating indicators in a way, not really out of the blue, because of course it's based on the need. But at the end it was like, okay, one of the big changes was from teaching, not only, but mostly face-to-face, in a classroom, let's say, to online. How can we measure that change? And the International Association of Universities did a really interesting report, including some indicators on the percentage of institutions and countries, et cetera, that had changed from teaching to online, in what period of time, how many did they cancel. Then Jamil Salmi did a report also on the pandemic, and he analyzed the preparedness. And then I'm trying to see this as an innovation process, and from an innovation perspective, it's like, we need to understand the need of data in order to respond appropriately. And I think he did a very nice work in terms of saying, okay, what do we need to understand the preparedness of the system to move online? And then he said, okay, well, what was the internet access across the world, which was, of course, it's extremely unequal and had consequences on the move online. And so in a way, it's to say that I think we need to serve the higher education system looking at what's going on and keeping this balance between creating new indicators for the new questions that arise. Sometimes we can think, now I think it's evident that technology-assisted, let's say, to put it in a generic term, learning processes will become more and more important. So I think that today we can think, okay, what would we like to assess? What is it important to assess in the long run? But there are other things that we may not be able to plan, like the pandemic. I don't think many people were expecting that, at least from the higher education information management perspective. And so, okay, but there were quick responses. So I think there needs to be a really kind of close dialogue and close look at what is going on in the system to respond properly, to have these metrics that matter. So yeah, that was some initial thoughts.
Thank you so much, Andrea. So let's start this second round about, trying to dig into some of these topics. I have some questions that I shared with you before. Probably, Professor Dev, do you want to start with yours? I have the, so you can control your presentation. Here you have it. Let me ask them to...
Okay.
Por favor, ¿podrían poner la presentación del profesor Dendev? Gracias.
Could you put up the presentation, please?
So much.
Yeah.
Please.
I just would like to say a few words about how to improve the higher education institutions' contribution to the public interest or society and national development in terms of the data and knowledge production. So I just, in order to answer this question, just show you several slides. It will help you to understand what I intend to say. So first, I would like to say that Mongolia has very young higher education institutions. We have established the first university in 1942. So today we have about 17 public universities. From these 17 public universities, 6 are the major universities. But the problem is that those universities are working in silo. They are not cooperating very much, and there is not much contribution to the society. That is the big question for the minister, how to make the more efficient and effective our higher education system. So that's why the minister has established a kind of alliance of 6 universities, but that is still not giving the fruit of this cooperation. So we need to strengthen this cooperation. So, on the other side, the government, the vision document, Vision 2050, and the recent the revitalization policy for economic recovery, those the government policies implies for the higher education to be more proactive in terms of the contributing to the national development and the society. So if you look at the international indicators, different indicators, the Mongolian position is not so satisfactory. So we need to also, another reason why the minister wants to change the higher education reform. And so I am very happy that everybody in this conference saying about the big changes in higher education everywhere. So if we will not change our higher education, it will go as usual and continue to work. And then by 2050, our universities will be in low-ranking club of universities, the world universities, and there is no way to have the big jump. And so that's why we are looking for some the possibilities, some experiences of other countries. And we also looked at our country, the map. The horizontal corridor is where population is concentrated, but this vertical corridor is where industry is concentrated. And so we are looking to have some first national research university in the crossroad of these corridors in order to bring the more benefit for the country. So that's why I think making this kind of the political bold decision will make our universities more responsible before the society and also before the countries, the government. And so that is one of the challenges for our ministry. And we are looking for different, the experiences of different universities around the world, how they changed the higher education system last 20 years. Mm-hmm. Some of them merging the universities, some of them creating some alliances or coalitions, etc. And so that is what we are facing at this point of the history of Mongolia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zandev. I think it's important exactly that, in terms of remembering that higher education institutions are not isolated institutions, but I mean, public policy and the responsibility of public authorities in terms of setting some sort of course that is of national interest is essential to organize the way these different institutions can work and move into and cooperate in that direction. Obviously, we can discuss if this direction is the best direction or the other one, or doing different things. That's what democracy is about discussing these things. But the role of the public authorities is essential in that regard. Otherwise, we have what we have in other countries, a set of disparate institutions that do not cooperate, or different institutions pursue their own particular interests without thinking about the country as a whole and the planet as a whole in terms of the relevant issues that we have to address together. Michela, I will ask you to continue.
Thank you very much. Cesar, when you were making your introduction, you were talking about the fact that information systems have much improved in basic education. And maybe there's an interrogation for us about what is necessary, actually, what produced this push to much better information systems in basic education. And I think the push came mainly from the fact that a lot of efforts, also internationally, concentrated on basic education. The development of universal access to basic education was, I mean, the main goal of the international community. And that produced a big push to planning for universalized basic education. And as a consequence, out of the planning imperative, so we know that, you know, big funder organizations like the Global Partnership for Education made it a compulsory requirement that countries would have a plan. And out of the planning need, countries being obliged to produce a plan, came the need actually to develop the information systems. So I think this is one of the main reasons why we have much better information systems today. I'm talking about, you know, many developing countries in the global south than we have in higher education. So I think, and when we think about it, you know, information systems for what? I mean, it's planning, it's transparency and accountability, I think, which can be strong driving forces. So Jonathan, you were talking about the fact that when you did your research, you found out that some countries have a lot of data available publicly on the websites, while others not. Others keep them in their, you know, maybe still statistical yearbooks, but they are there in a printed version in the ministry. They're not out there as data which can be consulted also by anyone publicly, so information as a public good. I think that is also a very crucial issue, that we need a much stronger commitment, I think, to making information available publicly, because that triggers the debate, which again triggers the need to maybe have more information available on some of the trends that Andrea, you were conferring to. So I think this is maybe one of the questions that we should ask ourselves. What can be the driving force to push up information systems? And of course, as a planner, I have a strong belief in planning, and I think it is particularly necessary at this point in time in higher education, as we have expanding higher education systems, and we need to project them into the future. We really need to ask ourselves, so how can we design the best mix of types of institutions, programs, the resource needs, and all that, and to do it in a cost-effective manner, I think requires system-level planning. And that, I think, if we make the preparation of such plans a requirement, a moral requirement, it's not a requirement that comes from funding agencies, I think we can get a strong push to develop management information systems and use also of big data that you were mentioning, Professor Berdash. So, I mean, just some inputs on thoughts, how we can move it forward, and what can be the driving forces here.
Thank you, Michaela. Jonathan?
Yeah, I think the one other dimension of this that just comes to mind for me is also there's the work that I think Andrea and others have highlighted around tracking different the more flexible kind of models of delivery that are happening now and so forth. But in some ways, I think on international data, that's absolutely the right agenda, and tracking that I think is the right way to go. But in some ways, we're even further back from this, right? Like one of the early transitions of higher education was higher education just being universities to higher education also including vocational higher education and so forth. And international data doesn't really deal with that. And that's been around for a very long time, right? And so that was, I'm going to keep leaning on our project, but the one of the revelations in our project, we didn't go out there thinking we're going to categorize all these institution types and so forth. It just so happened that collecting the data, we determined that it was not possible to understand higher education data if you did not classify institutions by different categories based on whether they were vocational and so on. It's just not possible. And so the current model of emphasis on ISCED levels has value, but it leaves a whole lot that cannot be understood about kind of international higher education, in my view, because ultimately within a country, you don't make decisions about how you finance your system based on the levels. You don't. That's not the organizing structure of a higher education system, right? Like the structure of the higher education system in Canada is we have universities and colleges, or very similar in the U.S. or take any number of other jurisdictions, but the organizing principle, generally speaking, is these different types of higher education institutions and then public, private, and so forth. And so I think that there need to be some adaptations in how, in kind of our global kind of infrastructure about how we gather data on higher education and interpret it, that start, I think, with a bit more reflection on institutional categorization in data collection, and then also get into then things like reflecting on part-time status and what does it mean, or what, not like full-time, part-time is relatively simple, and I think a lot of the data presently exists. We didn't dig into that, but there are data that could be gathered on that at present that would capture much of the world. But then there'll be reflections on micro-credentials and online learning versus in-person versus hybrid and so forth. So I do wonder if there's a moment that has come to do kind of a reflection on sort of what are the standards of data collection globally, and that may align with what we've spoken about in terms of primary and secondary. I think, but just to say, I think on the primary and secondary side, I mean, an advantage there is that we have a global sense of like a standard of what primary and secondary are, I think, without being an expert in that area. But I think there's a little more consistency in our understanding of what that is than would take place once you hit ISCED level 4 and post-secondary up, where you then are dealing with a greater diversity of kinds of education.
Thank you so much. I mean, you point to a topic that I don't know if everybody's aware of. International data on education is organized according to international standard classification of education, ISCED. And ISCED, since the 70s, organized the collection of data according to program orientation, not according to institutions. I mean, there are good reasons to do that, but also there are some problems that come from that. I mean, and if we go back to the way UNESCO compiled the statistics on education before ISCED, I mean, until the mid-70s, when the statistics were compiled by institutional levels, I mean, there was no distinction between what ISCED today calls post-secondary, non-tertiary programs. Actually, those were part of tertiary education in the 60s and 70s. I mean, for statistical purposes, I mean. So I guess there is an interesting discussion there in terms of what's the value of organizing this in terms of institutions, what's the value of organizing this in terms of program orientation, on what the sorts of programs, orientations, and institutions should come into the tertiary level bucket, so to speak. So I guess that really, I mean, sometimes we use the data without giving a second thought to these kind of problems that are absolutely crucial in the way that this whole thing is organized in terms not only of data collection and production, but therefore in the way we frame the problems. Exactly, and I guess that's really, really important. Andrea, please.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to follow up on Michaela's point about the driving forces. I think especially like considering this context, one driving force is and should be equity, equitable access, and equitable access to quality education. And in a way, what I've seen is that groups that have been discriminated or that are disadvantaged are the ones about which less data and less quality data is available because it's more challenging in a way. So when we see about refugees, Michaela has done a nice report on like the challenges to access data about refugees, and you were mentioning that. So if we want to leave no one behind, I think there needs to be a kind of positive discrimination, if you want, in terms of the efforts put towards looking at what's going on to those groups that are more disadvantaged. Because in a way, if you want the standard student, we have data about her or him. But about the learner, that is in more particular conditions, let's say, we have less data, and therefore we need to do more efforts to achieve that balance. And we see the same with disabled people. When I was preparing this report, I was shocked that there is 1 billion people on planet Earth with some sort of disability. It's a big proportion, and some are visible if you want, and some are not. And we don't know all about that, so we need to put more efforts. The same with equity, gender equity. We have moved a lot in that regard, and today there are 113 women and girls enrolled in higher education per 100 boys or men. So there are more girls on average, but again, that's enrollment and average, and there are gaps. And apart from that, I mean, of course, equity is not only about accessing to higher education. We need to go deeper into what happens between disciplines, what happens in the quality, what happens in leadership roles, what happens beyond first degrees, master PhDs, researchers, etc. So I think, yeah, one point that I wanted to highlight is I think we need to put specific efforts on well, those groups that are disadvantaged, and groups meaning persons in certain conditions, but also systems, education systems, countries, regions. Sub-Saharan Africa, unfortunately, in most of the general indicators we compared by the SDG regional grouping, I mean, massive gaps. I mean, the enrollment in higher education worldwide on average is 40%, and in Sub-Saharan Africa it's only 9%. Again, it's the only region that is far behind in terms of gender equality. So I think we need to put more attention in, of course, we're talking here about metrics and data knowledge production, and of course we need measures on policy and on planning, but also on data. And the other point about following on Michaela's kind of invitation to think about what are the driving kind of, well, the engines to decide in a way what to do, because there's so much possible data to collect and to analyze that we really need to choose, okay, what is important, what do we care about? And of course there are different agendas, and I think it's legitimate and good that we have different agendas within countries, within institutions, within type of roles in this big sector, but I think generally speaking, another one should be quality. And of course, what we understand by quality can vary, but it's also changing, because 30, 40 years ago, I don't think many people were questioning that actually learning content, let's say, having disciplinary knowledge was like the essence of universities. I still believe that that's a very strong pillar. And at the same time, I think that because knowledge is already easily available and changing so fast, not knowledge, information, we need to look also at other dimensions of quality. And that again includes things like social-emotional learning, which is very hard, and I think we need to be extremely careful with developing international metrics that measure this, because we have seen, I think, in different contexts that sometimes metrics can be, let's say, overemphasized in our policies and in our actions, meaning that we follow eventually the metric rather than the aim behind the metric. And I think this is an area in which we need to be particularly concerned and working on. But yeah, I think all this conversation needs to be directly linked with what our understanding by quality and by equity, and look at those kind of indicators that can contribute to that.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrea. I think it's very interesting, and maybe it goes back a little bit to some of these interrogations that you were having about finding balances, you know, between the global and the national. And it's very true. Should everything be available in an internationally comparative manner? Yeah. What should be not? We know that very quickly. Certain types of indicators can also be used as benchmarks, which they sometimes should not, because there are different contextual situations and countries, and so there can be also sensitivities to provide certain information in a comparative manner. And also, is it always so useful, because there are specific problematics in countries that need to be addressed by that country. And so maybe we in specific policy orientations, I think we should not be in a mode where we think that everything should be internationally comparable. The issue about equity is a critical one. I totally agree with you. But again, you know, each country has its own equity problematic. And sometimes it depends very much on the political economy of a country. What are the equity groups that get visibility? Yeah. You know, and they are the ones, you know, that push for data collection, and then you find data on certain social groups and not on others. Yeah. So you find them a very strong push, for instance, to having data on ethnic minorities in Latin America, because it's a very strong issue there, and because you have a political push behind it. Whereas in other countries, it's not such an issue. And so, I mean, I think these are all the considerations we have to keep in mind. What is useful to be available in an internationally comparative manner? And also, I mean, what are sometimes the limitations, the sensitivities? I mean, we had also our higher education conversation, and we said data is also, we should not lose track of the fact that data is also a political issue and many times has many political implications. So I just wanted to put that on the table as a consideration also for our discussion. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Miguel. Before opening up for the public, I will ask my colleague from the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, Saib Ufal, to make a presentation. I don't know if you have a microphone there. Please, can you help us with that? Yeah. Coming. Yeah, just a second, Said, please. He's coming. And please, if anybody else has a question or comment or, yeah, here. Anybody else, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Said.
Thank you very much. I think this is very, very interesting discussion, especially for us who are data producers at international level. My name is Said Vofal. I am responsible for education survey at the UNESCO Institute for Statistics. This is really very inspiring discussion and very useful for us who produce data at the international level. So the UIS is the official source and trusted source, international source for international comparable data in the area of competence of UNESCO. We produce data on education, science, culture and communication. Regarding specifically higher education, we produce annually data in partnership with OECD and Eurostat, also for the UNESCO, so-called UNESCO OECD Eurostat data collection. So we produce data, we collect and disseminate data on aspects such as participation to education, higher education and graduation also from higher education, financing of education, and we are the comprehensive source on international student mobility. So the UIS has a database that is 50 years, cover 50 years, the last 50 years data. And so, but the challenges exist in terms of data availability on higher education. So the main challenges are, I would classify them as in two categories. So we have technical challenges at the country level in terms of availability of information system, of data collection and use. And we have also the challenge in the revisiting the relevance of the indicators, the kind of data that we collect. And you, Jonathan, touched upon that. So regarding the first aspect of challenges, why we don't have so many good and comprehensive data on higher education at the national level? The reason might be diverse. So sometimes because, especially in the context of developing countries, the lack of information systems, because very often the priority is given to the foundation, to primary, secondary education. And in the context of developing countries also, these are the area where the development partners tend to support more. So in terms of prioritization, developing countries tend to prioritize the foundation, the level below higher education. We have also the specific character of higher education institutions that are autonomous, and sometimes they feel they don't have to report data at the national level. And sometimes also there is a lack of culture of use of data at the national level, because to have data at international level, you have to have data at national level, and to have a culture of planning based on data. So I think if one wants to address these issues, so you have to identify in each case what are the problems. And so what the UNESCO Institute for Statistics does to support countries? So we have methodologies and materials that are available for countries to use, such as ISCED classification, some methodological document on concept and definitions. We organize regularly training on higher education, so through workshops, through webinars, but yet still in the context of developing countries, there is absolute need to mobilize resources to support countries build information systems and collect data and use them at the national level primarily, and then at the international level. Now, regarding the relevance of the data at the international level. So by essence, the indicators that are used at the international level need to be limited, because if we multiply so I think the key question is, what do we need to add to the existing international indicators on participation, student mobility, financing, to be more relevant to the new trend in terms of online provision of higher education, the diverse and flexible ways of acquiring qualifications. For example, you talk about the categorization of institutions. So is it possible that we can add some of this information? But of course, the more you add of data at the international level, the more complex, because if you have a country that is struggling to provide basic number of students and by field of education, I think it's difficult to add more data to collect. The UNESCO Institute for Statistics is working specifically on to improve the definition of, for example, things like what is a professional education at the higher education, what is a general academic. This was not very much addressed in the new ISCED of field of education. But we, in collaboration with OECD and also with a committee on the review of ISCED that we are planning to put in place, we are planning to define new definitions of these concepts. So this is a very enriching discussion. So for this conference, we have produced this flyer, so this brochure, that show you the analysis of trend of the last 20 years in terms of participation, financing, and equity also of education. So you have a QR code that you can scan to get access to the database. We collect also not only administrative data, but we have also, in this database, we have data on attendance from to higher education from household survey data. That also show you, so you can analyze equity in terms of wealth, location, and so on and so forth. So this is very inspiring discussion, and we will certainly take a lot of idea from here to take to at the international level data production. Thank you very much.
On the contrary, thank you so much. Please, hay una persona aquí atrás.
Por supuesto.
Gracias.
Someone here at the back, thank you.
Hello, I'm Jaime Roser, UNESCO Institute for Higher Education, and I have a question about indicators of impact. We've been discussing about indicators of everything that happens during higher education, enrollment, equity, financing, quality, but not so much of what happens with the graduates after they leave the university. And of course, there are some information about it. There are institution-level surveys. Once in a while, countries or academics make a study, which is a snapshot of the situation of employability of graduates. But would you think that for policy planning purposes, we need countries to have more systematic periodic surveys or other forms of data gathering for indicators of impact. And not just for policy planning, but for another type of information consumer, which hasn't been discussed so far, which are the students and the families. We produce the data normally for the institutions, for the researchers, for the governments, but what happens with the prospective students that need to choose their studies? How many countries are there out there that are systematically telling their high school student their employability rates per program?
Yep. Thank you so much. Any other participation? One more. Here? One more. Thanks.
Gracias, muchas.
Thank you very much, Munoz. I'm a rector from the Cooperative University of Colombia. This panel has been very interesting, very enriching in terms of information systems, monitoring, and being able to identify the variables in order to ensure success of the student and have successful learning outcomes. There's one element with regard to data collection, and which is discrimination. We have indigenous students, migrant students, displaced students. We have victims of violence, students from coastal areas suffering from extreme poverty. If the data does not identify the condition of the student, we can't see how to actually help them to ensure that they are successful. Monitoring also, and changing the dynamic of data is very important. We can have data from 4 or 5 years ago, but they move, they change their status, so this data is living. And this process allows us to keep acting in terms of future success and to highlight the weaknesses of having a standard type definition of a student. It's very important. Thank you. Thank you very much for your contribution, and you've highlighted a problem which is very important here. The wealth of information at institutional level and how this can be transformed when you add national statistics and international statistics to that institutional knowledge. It's another area of difficulty which you've raised here.
Additional comment, Jonathan?
Yeah, I had a couple questions or comments. I think I wanted to just say briefly in response to our colleague from the Institute of Statistics that there have been a couple international interventions around that it's really worth highlighting. I reflect, or I often think about Sub-Saharan Africa in terms of addressing the gaps, right? Because there are just very large countries there where there's not a lot of data. So the UNESCO, I think, recently runs cyclical surveys of different higher education systems, recently released one for Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's terrific, right? Like that paints, provides a lot of information for a really, really important, really large country. And then the other organization, just to highlight, that has done really excellent work in Francophone West Africa, you can get really excellent kind of baseline data on higher education because of the work of, I think, starting out of l'UMOA, the Monetary Union of West Africa, did some kind of excellent work, and a number of countries have carried that forward. On outcomes, I think, the OECD countries, the OECD publishes outcomes data. There's always the challenge of how much is this, like how much do you trust this data? Like establishing causality in the data, I think, is just always such a big question mark. And so I'm always, for a huge chunk of the world, the challenge is the baseline, what is going on in the system. Like to me, establishing that, and then outcomes data, I think, largely comes from kind of studies that can happen by researchers that may be relatively modest. We're not talking the whole country or something, but you can do, I think I'm more interested in studies that maybe are done by academic research and so forth, that may actually establish the causality of different things. But, which is not to say that it's not important, what the unemployment rate is and so forth, but there's so much going on there. Anyway, those are a couple of thoughts.
Okay.
Yeah, perhaps on the employment or employability issue, I think we have a number of broad-based indicators like employment rates by level of educational attainment. So this gives us a very broad-based indication of the level of employment found by graduates. But when it comes really to analyzing how graduates integrate into the labor market, you really need to do it by academic program to really see, what are the employment rates by academic programs? And then, the commonly established methodology is conducting tracer studies. This is what we have been doing, for the past 30 years, really conducting tracer studies for graduates of given academic programs. But this is, of course, a vast enterprise. There are a lot of difficulties to trace graduates, maintaining contacts with them, tracing them, getting information back from them. But this is, of course, the most relevant information to trace employability. So I think, it's good to do this from time to time, and there's also an increasing number of higher education institutions that take responsibility for that, that do it for their graduates. And but it doesn't move up to, let's say, a nationally available indicator. But of course, which wouldn't make sense because this is really information you need by academic program.
Andrea?
Yeah, very briefly, just to comment on the impact question. I think we can discuss and explore impact on the three higher education missions. I think the state of the, let's say, impact analysis on each of the missions is different. So Michael and Jonathan already commented a bit on the educational, let's say, the learning mission. On research, I think that there has been, it varies between countries significantly, but in Europe, and I would say specifically in the UK, there has been a strong development and critique about the impact agenda, because basically there has been a lot of emphasis, including governmental funding, that is associated to academic productivity, basically based on publications in certain types of journals. And that is the impact, which again, as Jonathan mentioned, we need to see the causality and what is the actual impact that we are interested about. I think it's important to measure academic productivity for sure, but I think in some countries it has been perhaps given too much importance in relation to, and at the end, I think it's fine that we look at that, but that has diminished the attention to other aspects, I think, of in this case, of research. So I think we need to balance. And I think in the Netherlands, there was a movement towards kind of paying less attention to this impact agenda based on academic publications, precisely because they realized, perhaps we're a bit too much, we're paying too much attention on that. And then on community engagement, I've done some work on impact of community engagement, and it's interesting. There are so many types, let's say, of rather outcomes because of this challenge in drawing causalities. But I think we need to kind of advance in defining specific indicators that show, okay, what are we contributing as institutions in bidirectional ways with society in the community engagement bit. But again, I think it's trying not to oversimplify too much, to respect the richness of the community engagement activities that are extremely varied. I think that's an area that we need to work more on. But again, trying to keep this balance between, okay, let's measure and assess without standardizing. Because at the end of the day, there is a political responsibility in setting standards, because at the end you're saying this is what matters, therefore you need to do this in a way. And if you need to do this, somehow you are saying this is what you're not doing is not so important. So we need to be very careful on saying, okay, this is a key metric, because we're saying, yes, this is what matters, and because we're saying what is not in here, it's not so relevant. So it's an important decision.
Just a couple of seconds to wrap up. I mean, just two comments. First is thank you so much, Drag, Jonathan, Michela, Andrea, Said, and everybody for coming here. And the second is please tell the others that the conversation on data shouldn't be a conversation on figures and formulas. It can be a meaningful conversation on the actual political issues that are underlying the production and dissemination of information and data. Thank you so much for your participation. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Excellent moderation.
Yep.
Tu micrófono.